self-awareness, which is sort of a catch-all. Some people say self-awareness, some people say consciousness, and so forth. Some people say consciousness. We're not talking about whether you're asleep or not, unconsciousness. I haven't seen anyone seriously say that if you're asleep, you're not a person and we can kill you. And if they did, I would not continue the conversation with them. But they do tend to mean some kind of base level of cognition, like especially from a secular perspective. Why are humans special? Why do we care? And a lot of people, not everybody, but a lot of people will say it has to do with our higher brain functioning. That's the most obvious first thing you think of when you look at us compared to other species. So they say if you don't have that, then yes, you are biologically an organism within the human species, but it doesn't mean you are a person because you don't have the specialness, right? But the problem with that is that we don't apply that to born human beings. So people in comas, there are different kinds of comas, and some are more severe than others, and there's still a lot we don't know about them. But in general, we don't say that you become less of a person in a coma when you have less cognitive abilities. We especially don't say that if we know with almost certainty that in X amount of time, say 9 months, you will have the cognitive abilities we care about again, for sure. You could make an argument that if you have someone in a coma that you don't think is ever going to recover, then maybe there's an argument about that. And not that they're no longer a person, but maybe like, it's okay to pull the plug or not. That's a whole different thing. But if you know for sure they are going to recover, or there's like a 98% certainty they're going to recover, nobody's going to say they're not a person. Okay? So that's a problem. More to the point is newborns. Because the kind of higher cognitive functioning that we care about so much is not present at birth. And almost, not everybody, but almost everybody will say that a newborn is a person. And certainly you should not be able to kill them. To be fair, not everybody does say this. There are some pro-choice philosophers that take this problem with the consciousness argument seriously, but go the other way from us, where they say, yeah, you're right, newborns, they don't really have that, so it still would be really sad if you killed them, but I feel like it wouldn't be like killing a person. And then you're like, oh, okay, I'm going to move along now. The most infamous one is Peter Singer. But there was also a paper published, I think in the last 2 years, in the Journal of Medical Ethics, something about after-birth abortion, where these philosophers talked about different of the main reasons that we justify abortion and how there's no reason those wouldn't apply to newborns. And they got hell for it. They got death threats. And it wasn't just from pro-lifers. In fact, it was, if anything, pro-choicers who were more upset about it because of the connection being drawn. So there are people on the abortion rights side that recognize this problem with the consciousness condition, and they try to be consistent, and it ends up being really bad and creepy, and people don't like it. Most people will just deny that this is a problem for X, Y, Z reasons. So we had a journal, the Journal of Consciousness and Cognition, was looking at when, I'm just showing this to show you, I'm not just saying newborns don't have self-awareness. This has been researched heavily, and depending on how you define it, it could start at different ages. They had this study had 5 different definitions for self-awareness, including if you're doing basic tasks that would require you to be vaguely aware of yourself and the world around you. And what they found was that, in general, the earliest that newborns show this ability is between 12 and 15 months, give or take 3 months. So let's go super conservative and say 9 months. That means for birth to 9 months, you don't have the level of cognitive functioning we care about, and we still, not only do we not think it's okay to kill you, in general, most people who aren't like heavily in the abortion debate and getting kind of twisted about this, most people think that they are the worst people that you should kill. It'd be worse to kill a little newborn baby than most other people. So clearly this cognition thing, it doesn't really matter when we're talking about born people, and they only say it matters with the fetus. Now they might argue that has to do with level of development. Like, sure, okay, a newborn can't do calculus, but they have the physical necessities, the physical parts of the brain that they need to eventually do calculus. And we know that at certain points far enough back on the development line, that isn't present. I mean, the far left picture is a blastocyst. This is 2 days after fertilization. There's no brain there. And I'd like to point out, too, that when abortion rights advocates talk about clumps of cells and we get irritated because they're oversimplifying things, when you're talking about the blastocyst, it actually is a clump of cells. It's a very special, interesting clump of cells, but it is a sphere of cells. There's no heart, there's no brain, there's no pain. And to be blunt, when I see a picture of a blastocyst, I feel nothing. I feel interested. Like, from a scientific perspective, I think it's amazing. But if you ran around with pictures of this at pro-life rallies, people would be like, okay, well, I just not really worried about it. You know, like, it's not that compelling. But then again, this is 2 days after fertilization. Most pregnancy tests can't even detect pregnancy hormones until after implantation, which is at least 8 to 9 days later. And my point is that while most abortions do happen in early gestation, not this early. Unless you're talking about spontaneous abortion, which is miscarriage, different thing. Okay? So for the purposes of the practical purposes of the debate, I submit that this doesn't matter that much because we usually don't even know about it. Now, the middle picture is a 6-week embryo. At this stage, the embryo has a heartbeat, a functioning circulatory system, cerebral hemispheres in its brain, bronchi in its lungs, and a spinal cord with synapses. Now, does it have everything we have? No, it doesn't, and it's not supposed to. It's a 6-week embryo. But it has a lot, and this is when people get annoyed when they throw around the phrase clump of cells, because according to the CDC, 2/3 of all abortions happen after this point. Most abortions happen after this level of development. Okay? So clump of cells, it's certainly a simplification. I think some people feel like it's even derogatory, unless you mean it in the very literal sense, in the sense that I am also a clump of cells, because most living things, all living things are, but that's not what they mean. They mean that it doesn't matter, and they're sort of like begging the question of whether it matters or not. So, but did you see what I did just now? I skipped forward to the part where we can talk about things that have to do with recognizable features of humanity, and I ignored the blastocyst, right? Because in terms of the practical debate, the abortions that are actually happening are happening at much later stages than the blastocyst, so don't try to just focus all on the beginning. They make fun of us for saying the zygote is a human being, but in terms of practicality, does that matter? But in terms of principle, yes it does, because I kind of skipped over the blastocyst, but secular pro-life, along with many pro-life groups, say that life begins at conception and that's when we start caring, which includes that arbitrary sphere. We're saying that this matters too. We're saying the blastocyst matters too. And so the question is why? Why are we saying that this sphere, this blob, that doesn't look like anything matters so much? We say that because whether you are a person, a human being with moral value or not, is a function of what you are, not what you at a very moment are capable of doing. It's an intrinsic value to you, not a function of as you're developing, okay? So, as an example, talking about the consciousness thing again, because that thing comes up so much, at 2.5 weeks gestation, the neural groove and neural folds appear. At 3 weeks, the primary sections of the brain are visible. The cerebral hemisphere begins at 4.5 weeks. The first brain waves are detected as early as 6 weeks, more commonly at 8 weeks. And the cerebral cortex, which is what we need for higher brain function, begins at 13 to 15 weeks. And then I already talked about how actual higher brain function begins after birth. My point is that there's this continuum. And if you're going to argue that actual higher brain function is what's necessary, then logically you have to argue that newborns don't matter, and people aren't comfortable with that. If you're going to turn it the other way and say newborns don't have actual higher brain functioning, but they have the capacity to ultimately have it, then so do these guys. I'm just looking for an objective, consistent definition for the difference. And if you have to keep saying, well, yeah, but this, well, yeah, but that, then that's a problem for me. I'm just trying to be consistent. So, all you have to do when people give you a definition of person that's something in addition to being a human being is think, would this definition of personhood exclude any born human beings we consider people? And so far, every definition I've heard of would. Which is why we say in our second premise that there's no consistent objective distinction between a human being and a person, at least not one that anyone has presented us with yet. And if you want to get more into this, I know I have so much to cover. There's so much more on this, and you should check out some of the sources on here. There's some great arguments that get way more to the philosophy of this, but I just don't have time to go through all of it right now. So the first premise, the fetus is a human being, and then there's no distinction between human being and person. But science tells us biologically the fetus is a human being, but science doesn't tell you have to care. Science doesn't tell you anything about human rights. That's completely up to humans to talk about. So there's a third premise that's necessary to being pro-life, and that's believing that human beings merit human rights. You can agree the fetus is a human being that's not distinct enough from the rest of us, but maybe you don't think that matters for anybody, and then you probably won't be pro-life. Now, to be blunt, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because almost nobody makes that argument. They argue about the nature of the fetus, but they don't try to say human beings don't matter. And if they do, they're usually just trying to say it because they can't get around the nature of the fetus thing. There is a whole huge conversation about secularists and human rights. So if you're trying to argue from a secular position, Because from a Christian position, you can say things like, we are made in God's image, we have souls, and so forth. But if you're talking an atheist, it doesn't matter, right? So the question is, from a secular position, why should we care? And secular pro-life cannot take one specific position on this, because there are many different reasons that different seculars say they care about human beings. But I will say that they all care. Not literally all of them, but I mean, as much as anyone else. In fact, the secularists I know tend to be very passionate about human rights and justices, just not abortion, apparently. But anyway, so I will talk to you about, very briefly, one of those possible explanations, just to give you an idea. And again, it's in the resources, and if you want to look into it more, you can. But there is an atheist philosopher named Don Marquis, and he did an article called Why Abortion is Immoral. And he said that abortion is immoral because it's immoral to kill entities with futures like ours. And when he said that, he didn't mean just human beings. He said in a science fiction universe, if aliens came down who are as smart as or smarter than us, they would be persons too, even though they're not necessarily the human species. The point is that if you have a future like ours, and by that he means the ability to feel joy and pain and have a family and get a job and get fired and all the different things you can do, whether it's good or bad, we're not saying only a good future like ours, just a future like ours, then it is immoral to deprive someone of that future. And that would apply equally well to the preborn as the born. So you could read the whole article. He does it much better than I could do in a 15-second soundbite of what it's about. The bottom line is that almost everyone grants, whether they're secular or religious or whatever, that human beings generally should have human rights. We tend to focus on just asking them to be consistent. But if they want to actually have a conversation about why human beings should have human rights, it's good to be familiar with some of the secular reasoning for that, even if you personally hold totally different reasons. It's just good to have in your arsenal.